I first encountered Shakespeare when I was in year 6, when I was 11 years old. I was in my last year of primary school and was preparing myself for the leap into high school. I knew that we'd be studying Shakespeare in year 7 and was already skeptical about the relevance of an old playwright to me and my learning. Many of my older friends had already warned me about him. They found him boring, didn't understand his language or his iambic pentameter, and didn't warm to his themes and characters. Their cynicism could have become mine had I not decided to dive into Shakespeare a year before arriving here at MLC. So, being the English nerd that I am, I decided to read a few of the texts before getting to the school and make my own mind up about them. So I started to explore Romeo and Juliet, and something unexpected happened. As soon as I started reading the play, I totally fell in love with the beauty and poetry of Shakespeare's writing. Now, at this time, I knew nothing about him, where he lived, where he was coming from, anything about him at all. But when I read Romeo and Juliet, it immediately affected me. With the thoughts and views of my friends fresh in my mind, I was not expecting to enjoy reading a Shakespearean play. I was expecting a confusing, difficult, and unpleasant experience. But how wrong could I be? I absolutely loved it. Every night I would sit in bed devouring another line, another scene, another act, savouring the language and the rhythm of the text. I would read some lines over and over again, wondering how on earth that emotion could have been better expressed, and realising that it couldn't be. I realised that Shakespeare had captured emotions in such a way that to reduce them to a modern equivalent was to diminish the emotion itself. Sometimes I would let the unusual and new language wash over me, not trying to interpret it. Sometimes I would work sentence by sentence, letting the unusual sentence structure roll around in my mouth until its clarity revealed itself to me. It was a beautiful and amazing experience, and I remember how transforming the language was. And reflecting on it now, the act of looking at Shakespeare's work really got my mind whirring. Compared to the other things I was looking at in grade 6, reading Shakespeare was a joyful and playful experience, a time each night I savoured. It was thrilling yet somehow peaceful, and those early memories stay close to me now. So enough of that early encounter. 5 things happened to me as a result of reading Romeo and Juliet in grade 6. First, I wanted to read more Shakespeare. I was hungry for more of his works. I reached out to his other famous plays, Macbeth, Othello, The Tempest, many that I'd heard talked about, or that I saw for the first time on the spines of books in the second-hand bookshop where I searched for his works. I looked at plays that I'd heard talked about my entire life, Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, and others. Second, of course, I desperately wanted to see Shakespearean plays rather than just read them. My first port of call was television and movies. I was transported by the ultra-modern interpretation of Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann, starring Claire and Leo, perfectly cast as the star-crossed lovers. I then looked for the many movie versions of TV and would spend afternoons in the company of Hamlet, Othello, and other fantastic protagonists. I'd watch movies, scenes, or even just single moments from film adaptations on my big TV screen or even on my little laptop screen just before I went to bed. Thirdly, I was drawn to experience Shakespeare live in the theatre. Unlike many, I was coming to his work via the texts, so I yearned to see them performed in an intimate theatre environment. So I started asking my parents to take me to Bell Shakespeare productions, by shows put on by Sport for Jove, a company whose very name derives from a Shakespearean line from Othello, "She is sport for Jove," and any other company that were performing Shakespeare, Sydney Theatre Company, Belvoir and Griffin. I realised that Shakespearean plays were being performed in every kind of theatre, big or small, with wild variations on interpretation, settings, and focus. I began to learn that his plays written in the 1600s could reveal things still relevant to us today in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and even 21st centuries. Fourth, the thing that most profoundly affected me was a desire to act in Shakespeare plays. So I sought out opportunities to perform, and with a couple of other Shakespeare-inspired mates, we would look at the plays and pull out the pieces that moved us. This has all led me to today, where I do now have the chance to play some of the great Shakespearean roles. For several years, I've sat the Trinity exams, where examiners come out from London to judge performances of scenes from Shakespeare plays. I've had the privilege of playing characters like Macbeth in an all-female production here last year, Stephano from The Tempest, and great female characters like Helena and Adriana. And right now I'm in rehearsal for the production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where I'm playing Puck. It's safe to say that I couldn't imagine my life without Shakespeare. But the fifth thing that happened was that I became disappointed in our education system. It makes me angry to realize that had I not taken it upon myself in grade 6 to familiarize myself with his work, I may never have been in a position to properly engage with Shakespeare's writing. It's why I now so strongly believe that Shakespeare should be introduced to children when they are at their most open and curious, when they first start primary school. Because as I reflect on what it is that Shakespeare has taught me, I realize that it's only ever been partly about the language. Mostly it's been about the themes that he explored, and what we can learn about what it means to be human through his plays. Shakespeare teaches us about life. And when I say life, I mean jealousy and rage, love and passion, abandonment and redemption, loss and grief, power and influence, and life and death. Shakespeare, by the 1600s, had already scoped out every kind of human emotion, connection, and behaviour, and had weaved them through his plays, helping us understand ourselves. How could we keep that from children, and only introduce Shakespeare to a cynical teenager when they're told it's part of the HSC English curriculum, and immediately put it into the box of boring and compulsory? As a 16-year-old, I now know the kind of impact Shakespeare can have on a young person's life, and I'm convinced that he has remarkable potential to teach and educate and entertain young children. This year, as many of you would know, Australia is celebrating 50 years of the much-loved television program, Playschool. Just like my parents, I have fond memories of Big and Little Ted, Jemima, and the round, square, and arch windows. Whilst my parents remember early presenters like Benita and John, I remember Justine Clark singing to me about colours and numbers. Like thousands of other young people, I remember loving the show every afternoon after getting home from kindergarten. The words, songs, and phrases I learnt from that show will never truly leave me. This year, though, we are also celebrating the 450 years since Shakespeare began writing his plays and sonnets. And as we celebrate that anniversary, I believe we should seize the opportunity to integrate Shakespeare into the learning curriculum at the earliest possible time. Is it preposterous or ridiculous to suggest that children at such a young age could relate to Shakespearean language and texts? Do we know whether it would be too much to expect young children to be interested in a long-dead playwright when they still haven't mastered the basics of literacy and numeracy? Well, I don't think it is preposterous, and in fact, I think it's necessary. A study conducted by the Department of Education and Training Victoria found that through extensive research in neuroscience, scientists can understand how the younger brain functions and the conditions required for effective learning. Their research indicated that the early years, particularly 0 to 8, are critical for optimum learning and development. They also went on to say that early childhood professionals should be encouraging children to explore, solve problems, communicate, think, create, and construct. Such research tells us that humans are at their most open and curious when they are very young. It's why parents are encouraged to teach children multiple languages before they even know how to speak, or learn how to swim when they don't even know how to move properly. And it's not like we don't already expose very young children to the arts and culture in the hopes of extending their learning. Expectant mothers play Mozart and Beethoven to their growing wombs in the hope that this somehow starts the baby's learning process. After they're born, toddlers are then dragged to baby proms at places as auspicious as the Sydney Opera House to encounter orchestras, operas, and soloists. All of this very high art well before the Teletubbies or the Wiggles are even introduced. My own parents are forever reminding me of our fabulous trips to the Opera House on a Sunday morning when I was 2, where we sang arias and listened to great orchestral pieces. It's extremely sophisticated when you think about it. But the point is, there's plenty of research and advice around from universities, neuroscientists, and childhood professionals that promotes the idea that children exposed to these great works early will benefit across the course of their lives from this experience. In the same vein, toddlers are taken to museums and galleries, often in their prams or in baby Bjorns strapped to their parents to sit in front of the great painting masters or the fine collections of natural history from wars. And in early primary school, the exposure to art and history continues. I remember traipsing around the rocks in full convict costume in just grade 2. So it seems we have some confidence in young children benefiting from the exposure and connection to these forms of culture and history. Therefore, the leap to introducing Shakespeare into the early learning curriculum shouldn't be so hard to understand. And Shakespeare has a unique and special advantage. The words he first introduced into the English language, and which are so commonly used today, have already been spoken by young children by the time they arrive at primary school. They just don't know that they've been using words and phrases thanks to Shakespeare's brilliance. What a wonderful way to start a Shakespearean journey by learning that you've already been speaking his language. If children have ever been in a pickle, waited with bated breath, been told they have a heart of gold, gone on a wild goose chase, told they must be cruel to be kind, that they've worn their heart on their sleeve, or even that they've learnt about an arch-villain in a Disney film. Then they've all been listening and speaking to Shakespeare. To be precise, they've been using words from The Tempest, The Merchant of Venice, Henry V, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, and Timon of Athens. A little-known fact is that Shakespeare introduced over 2,000 new words and phrases into the English language. In his 52 years, Shakespeare gave more to the English language than any person living before or after. His words continue to pepper our conversations to this day. Words such as bedazzled, gloomy, accommodation, majestic, fashionable, addiction, assassination, bloody, and my favourite, which all modern teenagers would struggle to live without, swagger. According to F. Max Muller, a Victorian word expert, in Shakespeare's time, an ordinary worker wouldn't have more than 300 words in their vocabulary. Today, most people use between 7,500 and 10,000 words in their everyday writing and speech. Shakespeare used 15,000 words in his plays, a portion of which he invented himself by merging existing words and anglicising vocabulary from foreign languages. If we think about the kind of revolutionary work Shakespeare was doing at this time, it's almost unbelievable. It's only too obvious to see the kind of influence he's had on the way we all communicate. So, in light of all this, who better than to teach young children about the English language when they are first curious about it than Shakespeare? I know I would have enjoyed spelling, comprehension, and word construction so much more if Shakespeare had been a part of the curriculum. Shakespeare was known as the master of prefixes and suffixes. He used them to create words like inaudible, disheartened, and uncomfortable. He was one of the first writers to use these devices to create new meanings and contexts for words. Imagine learning about nouns and verbs, prefixes and suffixes, and phrases we now consider cliches by listening to the Macbeth soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with its surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all here. But in these cases we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. As I've previously said, Shakespeare was also the master of teaching life lessons through capturing the human condition in his plays. His words have even formed the basis for many modern appropriations from which young people learn valuable lessons. His themes and ideas have transcended time and place to be universally accepted. A very popular film known by teenagers, She's the Man, is an appropriation of Twelfth Night, starring Channing Tatum and Amanda Bynes. Some would know that The Taming of the Shrew is the basis for the much-loved teen classic 10 Things I Hate About You, starring a young Heath Ledger. Romeo and Juliet was the inspiration for the musical West Side Story, which explores family rivalry and the cost of love across boundaries. And children of all ages may be very surprised to learn that the smash hit The Lion King is actually a retelling of Hamlet. So without Shakespeare, we may never have come to love Pumbaa, Timon, and Simba. He was also an expert at capturing and exploring emotions. In The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare shows us how sometimes there is no explanation for our despair. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. He taught us about jealousy, or the green-eyed monster. Love, betrayal, explored questions of identity, and even race relations. How much more equipped to understand life would we be as young people if it was Shakespeare's characters used to instruct us, rather than mundane personalities like Dick and Jane, and the like? For a contemporary child, perhaps Shakespeare could be a better impulse for electronic games. Instead of Candy Crush and Super Mario, perhaps we could give children To Be or Not to Be, or the classic Double Double Toil and Trouble. Too far-fetched? I think not. Our current Prime Minister talks of creating a creative nation with innovation and agility at its core. Perhaps we could better arm our young people with creativity and curiosity by introducing Shakespeare early in a child's life. Imagine the creative force unleashed by such a program. Even as recently as last month, the World Economic Forum devoted a blog to the 7 leadership lessons of Shakespeare. Many of these lessons could be adapted as life lessons for young people who will then navigate the complexities of the modern world. A recent article by Rachel Buchanan in The Conversation revealed that many of the arguments Germaine Greer discussed in her feminist manifesto, The Female Eunuch, were backed up by Shakespeare. Greer's constant use of Shakespearean references in her chapter on the middle-class myth of love and marriage is quite astounding. It's clear that if Shakespeare has the power to influence one of the most important books ever written, he sure has the power to transform young people into intelligent and curious thinkers. So turning to how Shakespeare could be adapted for a teaching tool for young people, I have the following suggestions. Designing classes around specific Shakespearean texts. I think plays like Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet would be fantastic starting points. What young child doesn't want to learn about magical fairies and beings and a group of cheeky mechanicals causing havoc in Athens? During English classes, extracts or even single lines of Shakespeare can be analysed to understand meaning. The Board of Studies can take a break from lesson plans and let Shakespeare teach the class. In terms of exploring emotion in Shakespeare's plays, children will have their own issues about family disputes, friendships and emotions running through their minds as they read. A study at Cornell University in the College of Human Ecology reveals that by the time children are in preschool, they already know a lot about other people's desires, preferences, beliefs and emotions. Wouldn't it be fantastic if they were able to explore this through the work they look at in class? Why would we limit children to just basic studies when they could learn more about the emotions they experience every day? The kind of workshops that should be introduced into young people's lives have already been created. Sport for Jove Theatre Company, for example, runs a workshop in Year 7 about exploring Shakespeare. But what I'd like to see is a workshop modified for children far younger than that. It's not about shoving how much to be or not to be soliloquy into the laps of 6-year-olds. It's merely about introducing Shakespeare to a younger audience. It's an important structural change to our education system that will ensure a new wave of learning and experience for children as young as 5. And outside the classroom, it's as simple as acting out scenes with children in the playground, assigning characters and getting used to the rhythm of the language. Finding the fun and enjoyment in Shakespeare's works is not particularly hard to do. We just don't do it enough, or early enough. The journeys that Shakespeare takes us on through his plays reveal to us the sheer magnificence of the English language. Shakespeare forces us to look at language in a new light, with an inquisitiveness that is rarely summoned in school English classes. He prompts us to discover aspects of ourselves we didn't know existed and be openly curious about the world that we live in. Are these all attributes we want the next generation of young people to have? Never has one human being encompassed the talents of a poet, writer, artist, teacher, and revolutionary quite so much as Shakespeare. Remembering back to my earliest encounter with Shakespeare in just grade 7, exploring Romeo and Juliet while tucked under the covers in my bedroom, I realised that I wish I'd had that experience so many years before. That's my vision, a future where children love Shakespeare as much as I do and really fall in love with the language. As Shakespeare said himself through Gremio in The Taming of the Shrew, "Oh, this learning, what a thing it is." Thank you.